Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1887. The advertisement in the Cheyenne Daily Leader described a cattle operation of considerable scale in the Platte River Valley. It mentioned a well-maintained property, steady income, and a position of genuine partnership for the right woman. It did not mention that the cattle operation was 41 head of half-wild longhorns that had not been properly worked in 2 seasons. The well-maintained property was a ranch house, with a collapsed porch, and a chimney that drew smoke back into the kitchen instead of out of it. And the genuine partnership meant that Jasper Cade needed someone to handle his books, his correspondence, and his increasingly angry creditors before the bank in Laramie, called his note in the spring. The advertisement in the same paper, placed 3 weeks earlier by a woman in Cincinnati, described an experienced bookkeeper with a background in estate management, seeking a position of stability in the Western Territories. It mentioned organizational skills, a head for figures, and an ability to manage complex household affairs. It did not mention that Vera Hollins had lost her position at the Hollins and Carruth accounting firm when Hollins, her late father, died, and Carruth dissolved the partnership and handed her desk to a man with half her experience and twice her confidence. It did not mention that she had applied to 14 different firms in Ohio and been turned away from every one of them. It did not mention that she had exactly $31, a train ticket she had purchased on credit, and the absolute refusal to spend another winter in her brother's house, being told she was welcome to stay as long as she needed, in the tone of voice that meant the opposite. They were both desperate. They were both too proud to say so. They would spend the better part of a year pretending otherwise. Jasper Cade was 41 years old, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that made people assume he was older than he was. He had inherited the Platte River Ranch from his uncle 9 years ago when the ranch was profitable, the herd was healthy, and the books were kept by a man named Fenton, who died of pneumonia the following winter. Jasper had kept the books himself after that. This was the source of most of his problems. He was an excellent cattleman. He could read weather by the color of the grass, could tell a sick animal from a healthy one at 50 yards, could work 16 hours without complaint and sleep 4 hours and do it again. What he could not do and had never been able to do was make a column of numbers balance. The ranch books were not so much kept as survived. They were an artifact of optimism, written in pencil, heavily erased and occasionally crossed out entirely and started over on a new page. He had placed the advertisement because his lawyer told him he had to. Not those words exactly. His lawyer, a precise man named Gable who wore the same brown suit every time Jasper saw him, had said, "You need someone who can read a ledger and speak to the bank without losing their temper, Jasper. And that someone is not you." He was not wrong. The last meeting with the bank had ended with Jasper putting his hat on the table with a force that made the loan officer flinch. He was not looking for a wife. He was looking for someone who could keep him from losing the only thing that mattered to him. Vera arrived on the Union Pacific in October, which was the worst possible month to arrive in Wyoming if you did not know Wyoming, and the best possible month if you wanted to understand immediately what you had agreed to. The sky was the color of iron. The wind came off the Laramie Range with the kind of intention that felt personal. She stepped onto the platform wearing a gray traveling coat, carrying a leather satchel that clearly contained papers rather than clothing, and an expression that Jasper would later describe to no one in particular, as already calculating something. Jasper was late. He had been late because one of the longhorns had gotten through a fence that morning, and he had spent 2 hours in the cold retrieving her. He arrived at the depot with mud on his boots and a tear in his jacket that he had not noticed. Vera Hollins was standing with her back to the wind and her eyes on the town, which was not much of a town to look at. When he said her name, she turned and looked at him from his boots to his hat in a way that was not rude exactly, but was absolutely professional. She was taking inventory. He said, "Miss Hollins, I'm Jasper Cade." She said, "I know. You're 40 minutes late." He said, "I had a situation with a cow." She said, "Is that like to happen often?" He said, "More often than I'd like." She said, "Then we should establish a protocol for communication when you're delayed." She picked up her satchel. "I'd like to see the books today if possible. I read on the train that your note with the Laramie Bank is due in April, which doesn't leave us much time." Jasper Cade stood on the platform in the October wind and felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was profound relief. The second was the faint, uncomfortable suspicion that he had just hired someone who was going to know more about his ranch than he did within the week. He was right on both counts. The drive to the ranch took an hour. Vera asked questions the entire way. Not conversational questions, specific questions. How many head? What weight at last count? What price per pound at the Cheyenne market last fall? What was the terms of the banknote exactly? What was the current outstanding balance on the feed account at the general store in town? Jasper answered what he could. There were several questions he could not answer, which he admitted with a flatness that she appeared to respect. She looked at the ranch house when they arrived. She looked at the collapsed porch. She looked at the chimney, which was already producing a thin thread of smoke sideways into the wind. She said, "Is the chimney drawing properly?" he said. It draws fine. She went inside. The smoke in the kitchen was not thick, but it was present. She looked at the stove, the ceiling, the angle of the flue. She said, "It's not drawing fine, there's a blockage or a structural problem. We should fix it before winter or we'll have a fire risk." He said, "I've been meaning to get to it." She said, "What's the priority order for repairs on the property?" He said, "I don't have one written down." She opened her satchel and took out a notebook. She wrote priority repairs at the top of the first page and looked at him and waited. That evening while Jasper cooked, badly but without apology, Vera sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers. She did not speak for 2 hours. Jasper had expected questions, arguments, gasps of dismay. What he got was silence and the occasional sound of a pencil moving across paper. When she finally set down the pencil, she had the expression of a doctor who had finished an examination and was choosing her words. She said, "You've been carrying this note at a variable rate." He said, "Yes." She said, "The rate adjusted twice in the last 3 years." He said, "I know." She said, "Your ledger doesn't reflect either adjustment." A pause. He said, "I was aware there was a discrepancy." She said, "The discrepancy is $412. The room was quiet except for the stove. He said, "Can it be fixed?" She said, "Everything can be fixed if you have enough time and enough information. The question is whether we have either." She closed the ledger. "I'll need 3 days to go through everything. I'll also need to speak to your lawyer," he said. "Gable," she said, "I'll need everything he has in writing. Verbal arrangements are not arrangements." Jasper looked at Vera Hollins sitting at his kitchen table with his ledgers and his future laid out in front of her like a problem she had not yet decided was solvable, and felt something he had not felt since his uncle was alive. The specific relief of having someone in the room who understood what needed doing and was not afraid of it. He built her a proper workspace before she asked for one. He brought a table from the spare room, angled it toward the window for the light, found a chair with a back that was not broken. He did not say anything about it. He just did it. She arrived at the workspace the next morning, sat down, and got to work without comment. That was the beginning. What Vera had not told the advertisement, and what she did not tell Jasper in those first weeks, was that she had not simply managed books before. She had been the operational mind of Hollins and Carruth for 6 years while her father's health declined. She had managed payroll, contracts, creditor negotiations, quarterly filings, and the firm's correspondence with 2 banks and a railroad. She had done all of this under her father's name, at her father's desk, while he sat in his office and drank tea, and occasionally signed what she put in front of him. When he died, Carruth had thanked her for her service, offered her a letter of reference for a position as someone's household secretary, and hired a man to take her desk. She had been 34 years old and had spent 6 years becoming invisible so the work could happen, and she was done with invisible. Wyoming was not what she had expected. She had expected wild and had found it. She had expected hard and had found that too. What she had not expected was the specific quality of the silence. Not the silence of a city at night, which is never truly silent, but the silence of distance, the silence of a place where the land goes on past seeing and the sky is large enough to make you feel, not small exactly, but correctly sized. Like the world is the right scale again after years of being compressed into offices and ledgers and rooms where the windows faced brick walls. She did not like it. She was not sure yet whether she was supposed to like it. She filed the feeling away and kept working. In 3 days she had a full accounting of the ranch's position. In 5 days she had a meeting with Gable, who she recognized immediately as a man who had been underestimated by the people he worked for, and was therefore pleasantly surprised by her. They spoke for 2 hours. She came back with a proposal for restructuring the note, a list of non-essential expenses to cut before January, and a potential buyer for 12 head that were not earning their feed costs. Jasper looked at the proposal. He said, "You want to sell the 12, she said. "They're costing more to feed than they're worth at current market." "It's not a close call," he said. "I raised 4 of them from calves," she said. "I know. That's not a financial consideration." A long pause. He said, "No, it's not," she said. "It's your decision. I'm telling you the numbers." He sold 10 of the 12. He kept 2. He did not explain why those 2 specifically. The weeks passed the way weeks do on a working ranch. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a weight and a texture that you feel in your body at the end of each day. Vera learned the rhythms of the place out of necessity. She could not do her work without understanding the operations, and she could not understand the operations without walking the property, watching the work, asking questions that Jasper answered in the fewest possible words. He was not unfriendly, he was economical. He said what needed to be said and stopped when it was said. She found this, unexpectedly, restful. She had spent years in rooms where men talked around their point for 20 minutes and then apologized for taking her time. Jasper Cade got to the point or he didn't talk at all. She was not warming to the place. She told herself that clearly. This was a position, not a life. She would stabilize the ranch, see it through the spring note, and then decide what came next. She had not decided what came next, but she was 34 years old and she was not going to spend the rest of it in Wyoming because a cattle operation needed a bookkeeper. What shifted the way things shift on a ranch in winter, not dramatically but in accumulation, was the work itself. She had been keeping books for her father's firm since she was 28. She was good at it, and it was necessary, but she had never been in the room where the decisions were made, only the room where the decisions were recorded. Here, she was in the room. Here, when she said the 12 head were not earning their feed, Jasper considered it and acted. Here, when she told Gable the rate adjustment hadn't been properly reflected and the bank owed the ranch a corrective credit, Gable went to the bank and came back with the correction. The numbers she worked with here did something. They had consequences. They changed things. She had not known how much she had missed that. In December, Jasper's fence line on the North Range came down in a windstorm. He spent 3 days repairing it in temperatures that dropped below zero by nightfall. He came in each evening colder than Vera had seen a person be and still functioning. Ate whatever she put on the table without comment, and went to bed. She had been handling the cooking since October without discussion, which she resented slightly, but she had discovered that she was competent enough at it when the goal was function rather than presentation, and Jasper required function. He ate everything. He never complained. This she respected. On the second night of fence work she made soup, a real one, not the grudging kind, because the temperature outside was serious, and she had looked at his hands when he came in and they were the color of plum skin. She put the soup in front of him and sat across the tables and said, without looking up from her notebook, "You need better gloves." He looked at his hands. He said, "These are the ones I have." She said, "I'll add it to the supply list for next week's trip to town." He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." He ate the soup. He said after a minute, "This is better than what you usually make." She said, "I know that too." He looked up. She kept her eyes on the notebook, but there was something in the set of her mouth that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. He bought the gloves. He left a pair of wool-lined ones on her workspace the following week without comment. Her hands had been cracking from the cold water she used to work the hand pump in the mornings. She did not mention that she had noticed him notice. The note came due in March, not April. Vera had caught an error in the original terms during her review, and the actual due date was the 15th of March, which she discovered in January and spent 3 weeks fixing. She renegotiated the rate with the bank using the corrective credit as leverage. She presented Gable with a payment schedule that protected the core herd and the property while retiring the variable portions of the debt. The banker, a man named Whitfield who had clearly expected Jasper to come in person and come in defeated, sat across the table from Vera Hollins with her ledgers and her numbers and her absolute refusal to be uncertain, and agreed to the terms she proposed. She told Jasper that evening. She told him the number, the rate, the terms. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "You bought us 2 more years." She said, "At minimum." He said, "How?" She explained the corrective credit, the leverage, the rate negotiation. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without performing attention. When she finished he said, "Gable said it wasn't possible." She said, "Gable was working with incomplete information." He said, "I should have hired someone like you 3 years ago." She said, "Yes, you should have." He looked at her. She looked back. The fire in the newly repaired chimney, she had arranged for a mason from Laramie to fix it in November, and it had drawn perfectly since. Moved light across the table between them. He said, "What happens now for you?" She said, "I haven't decided." He said, "You could stay." A pause. She said, "As your bookkeeper." He said, "I wasn't thinking of it that way." Vera Hollins, who had spent 6 years making herself invisible in an office in Cincinnati, and before that a lifetime being told that a woman with her abilities would do best to apply them quietly and in support of someone else's name on the door, sat in a ranch house in Wyoming with a man who said what he meant and stopped talking when he'd said it, and felt the specific vertigo of someone who has been leaning against a wall for a long time, and suddenly discovered the wall as a door. She said, "I'd need it in writing." He said, "The staying part or the not thinking of it as bookkeeper part?" She said, "Both. The thing that made it real, not the negotiation, not the gloves, not even the saved note, was a morning in late March when a buyer came out from Cheyenne to look at the improved herd. He was a large man with the particular confidence of someone used to setting the terms of every conversation. He spoke to Jasper. He continued to speak to Jasper even when Vera answered his questions. He adjusted his body to put her slightly behind him, the way some men do without realizing, the way some women absorb without comment because correcting it costs more energy than it's worth. After 20 minutes of this, Jasper stopped mid-sentence, looked at the man and said, "You should be talking to her. She knows the numbers. I know the cattle. You're asking about numbers." The buyer looked at Vera. He recalibrated. He asked his questions to her directly and she answered them, and by the end of it he'd agreed to a price that was 8% over what he'd offered at the start. After the man left, Vera did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." Jasper said, Yes, I did, she said. Most men wouldn't have. He said, I know. She looked at the buyer's wagon getting smaller on the road south. She said, quietly, thank you. He said, don't thank me for something that should have been obvious. They were not in love yet. But they were standing on the same side of something. And on the high plains of Wyoming, that was how it usually started. Not with a declaration. With a choice. They were married in June 1888 by a judge in Laramie, because Vera said she preferred a judge to a preacher, and Jasper said he preferred whatever she preferred, and that was the end of the discussion. She wore the gray traveling coat because it was the nicest thing she owned, and she was not sentimental about clothes. He wore a jacket without a tear in it. Their two witnesses were Gable and the mason who had fixed the chimney. Because they were the two people in the county who had done something that genuinely needed doing. Over the next 20 years they turned 41 head into 400. They added sheep against Jasper's initial objection, because Vera ran the numbers and the numbers were clear. They added a proper office with 2 desks, side by side, because she said she was not going to keep working at the kitchen table for the rest of her life, and he built it that winter. Badly at first, then better, which had become something of a pattern with him. Vera became known in Laramie County as the woman you consulted before you went to the bank, not after. Ranchers' wives sent their husbands to her. A few of the ranchers came themselves. She charged a fair rate and wrote down everything. Jasper always said she could have run the county. She always said she was running it. Just from a ranch in the Platte River Valley, and without the bother of being elected. Jasper Cade died in 1911 at 65, which was older than most cattlemen lived to be, and which Vera attributed to regular meals, a properly drawing chimney, and the absence of a $400 racking error hanging over his head. Vera lived until 1924. She was 71. She kept the books until the end, her own and anyone else's who asked. She came expecting a position. He came expecting someone to handle his ledgers. They were both right, and they were both so completely wrong about what they were actually getting that by the time they understood it, it was already the best thing either of them had ever done. I've told stories about people who built things the hard way, out of frozen ground and bad circumstances, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has run out of other options. Jasper and Vera weren't the ones who fell in love first and figured the rest out later. They were the ones who figured out the work first and arrived at everything else the way you arrive at a good decision. Slowly, carefully, and certain by the time they got there. So I'll ask you what I always ask at the end. Who do you think took the bigger risk? Vera, who left everything she knew for a ranch that might not make it through spring? Or Jasper, who let someone see the real numbers when everything was on the line? Leave me your answer in the comments. I read everyone.